The sound of drums echoed in Ouagadougou as two men stood side by side, one young dressed in the fatigues of a soldier-turned-statesman, the other older seasoned carrying the heavy responsibility of leading an entire regional bloc. Before the cameras and the people, the President of Sierra Leone, who currently serves as the Chair of ECOWAS, raised his voice with a message that few expected to hear: gratitude, brotherhood, and solidarity with Captain Ibrahim Traoré and the people of Burkina Faso. For months, the headlines had painted a very different picture. They told us that West Africa was divided, that the withdrawal of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger from ECOWAS had created an unbridgeable rift. Many claimed Traoré's nation was now isolated, left to face its security crisis alone. Yet here on this day, the scene told another story. The visitor did not come with threats or conditions, but with open arms. He said clearly, "We are one family. We must resolve our problems as a family. And Burkina Faso is not alone." This was not the language of division. It was the language of reassurance of a leader who had once been a soldier himself and who had walked through the fires of war in his own country before restoring peace. He came to say what was possible in Sierra Leone can also be possible in Burkina Faso. But the question remains, is this simply symbolic diplomacy, or does it signal a new chapter where Africa begins to heal its wounds from within without waiting for outside powers to dictate the terms? Can President Ibrahim Traoré's determination to defend sovereignty and development truly find allies even within ECOWAS itself? Stay with us as we uncover the full meaning behind this extraordinary visit. Please share if you feel that you are among the first to support President Ibrahim Traoré's struggle. And subscribe if you believe the truth of Africa's story matters more than the headlines written abroad. The visit began with the simplest of gestures: gratitude. The President of Sierra Leone, speaking not just as the leader of his nation, but as the acting chair of ECOWAS, thanked Captain Ibrahim Traoré and the Burkinabé people for the welcome given to him and his delegation. His words may have sounded diplomatic on the surface, yet the weight behind them was unmistakable. At a moment when the world expected hostility, he came with respect. At a moment when many predicted silence, he came with a voice of recognition. He reminded the audience that he was not just a guest, but a brother. Twice now he had come to Burkina Faso, and this second visit carried a message deeper than protocol. It was a demonstration of solidarity, a public acknowledgement that Burkina Faso's struggle is not being ignored by its West African neighbors. Standing in the heart of Ouagadougou, he declared that the world must know what the Burkinabé are enduring and that peace must be restored. This was no small statement. Since Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger announced their withdrawal from ECOWAS and formed the Alliance of Sahel States, AES speculation has been relentless. Commentators in Washington, Paris, and even in Accra insisted that the region was fractured beyond repair. Yet here was the leader of ECOWAS itself insisting otherwise. We are one family. Our problems must be resolved as a family. His words struck a powerful chord. They challenged the narrative of isolation and replaced it with a vision of kinship. He emphasized that development must be a common goal for all West African nations, and that even in times of division, the deeper bond of shared history and destiny cannot be erased. More than once he spoke of peace, and when he did, he was not speaking as a distant observer. He reminded the Burkinabé people of his own past. He too had once worn a military uniform. He too had faced the chaos of civil conflict in Sierra Leone, where his people endured unspeakable suffering. But from that dark period, he had emerged as a president who managed to bring stability back to his country. If it was possible in Sierra Leone, he implied, then it is also possible here. It was a powerful parallel. Burkina Faso today is a nation caught between the weight of insurgency and the hunger for sovereignty. The young Captain Traoré represents hope for millions, yet he carries an almost impossible burden to restore security while also charting a new model of governance. In welcoming his West African counterpart, Traoré received something rare: not criticism, but recognition. Not condemnation, but encouragement. The President of Sierra Leone went further, extending his solidarity beyond Burkina Faso to include Mali and Niger, the two other members of AES. He made it clear these three nations were not estranged cousins, but brothers. They remain part of the larger West African family no matter what political lines are drawn. His message was a reminder that geography and bloodlines cannot be broken by the stroke of a pen. For the Burkinabé people listening, this mattered deeply. In villages and towns across the Sahel, there has been real fear that leaving ECOWAS would mean total abandonment, fewer trade opportunities, no regional allies, and only enemies at the borders. This visit directly countered those fears. It told farmers, traders, mothers, and soldiers alike that they are not alone, that their cries for dignity have not fallen on deaf ears. Of course, words alone do not solve the problems of terrorism or rebuild destroyed communities. But words matter, and in African politics, symbols matter just as much. The sight of a West African head of state standing beside Ibrahim Traoré, calling him brother and pledging support, became a symbol of resilience. It reminded the world that even in division, Africa can still find the language of unity. The moment of climax came not from fanfare or ceremony, but from a single sentence. With the world watching, the President of Sierra Leone looked directly at the cameras and said, "Some believe we are divided because Burkina Faso and the countries of the EAS have left ECOWAS. But I tell you, that is not the case." It was a declaration that sliced through months of speculation, a statement that carried the weight of defiance against every headline predicting the collapse of regional unity. For many Burkinabé gathered in Ouagadougou, it was as if a heavy shadow had been lifted. They were no longer listening to foreign commentators framing their country as abandoned. They were hearing with their own ears the assurance that their brothers still stood beside them. In that instant, the narrative shifted. What the world had framed as a divorce was reframed as a family dispute, painful, yes, but never permanent. His words turned isolation into inclusion, replacing fear with cautious hope. This was the crescendo of his speech, the point where diplomacy transformed into solidarity. The reactions inside Burkina Faso were immediate and emotional. In the crowd, elders nodded with approval, whispering to their grandchildren that Africa had not forgotten them. Mothers carrying children in their arms wept softly, remembering the funerals of loved ones lost to violence, clinging to the idea that peace might yet return. Young men, some wearing military fatigues, clenched their fists in determination, hearing in the visiting president's words a recognition of their sacrifices. For the government of Ibrahim Traoré, this was more than symbolic. It was political oxygen. Ever since Burkina Faso joined Mali and Niger in forming the EAS, the question of legitimacy had haunted them. Were they reckless in leaving ECOWAS? Had they burned bridges they could not rebuild? This moment suggested otherwise. By standing in Ouagadougou and rejecting the idea of division, the ECOWAS chair gave Traoré something his critics insisted he could never have: validation from within the very bloc he had left. The international press, however, was more conflicted. In Paris, commentators dismissed the words as mere politeness, insisting that real fractures still exist. In Washington, analysts warned that the statement revealed cracks in the strategy to isolate Burkina Faso. In Accra and Abuja, political elites worried aloud: if even the ECOWAS chair refused to condemn X openly, what message did that send about the future of regional authority? But beyond the halls of power, ordinary Africans heard something different. Across radios in Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea, and Côte d'Ivoire, listeners caught the rebroadcast of his remarks and debated them in markets and living rooms. Many saw in his voice an echo of something they had longed for: an Africa willing to solve its own crises without waiting for approval from Europe or America. Not everyone was convinced. Skeptics within ECOWAS pointed out that kind words do not replace treaties or trade agreements. They asked, will Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger return to the fold, or will this family rhetoric mask a permanent break? Civil society groups worried that while leaders spoke of peace, the gunfire in the Sahel still claimed lives every week. And yet, even with those doubts, the symbolic power of the moment could not be denied. A man who had himself been a soldier, who had carried his country through war and restored peace in Sierra Leone, was standing in Burkina Faso to say, what was possible for us can also be possible for you. It was a testimony of lived experience, not hollow promises. For the Burkinabé, this climax was not just political theater. It was a reminder that their suffering is visible, their sacrifices recognized, their resilience admired. It was a spark of hope in a season of uncertainty. The aftermath of the visit rippled far beyond the ceremonial stage. For ordinary Burkinabé citizens, the sight of a West African president declaring solidarity carried a deeply human impact. In villages long terrorized by insurgents, radio broadcasts of his speech brought a fragile comfort. Farmers in the fields paused to listen. Mothers preparing meals for their families shared the message with neighbors. Even in displacement camps where thousands live with little more than tarpaulin roofs over their heads, the news spread quickly. We are not forgotten. We are not alone. This reassurance mattered. In recent years, the narrative of isolation had been suffocating. After Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger announced their withdrawal from ECOWAS, fears of trade blockades, border restrictions, and regional hostility grew like wildfire. Many Burkinabé believed they had been abandoned not only by the international community, but even by their African neighbors. The Sierra Leonean president's words pushed back against that despair. They reminded citizens that their struggle for security and dignity was still acknowledged within the West African family. On a political level, the implications were even more profound. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, whose leadership is constantly scrutinized both at home and abroad, the visit was a rare diplomatic victory. He could point to this moment as proof that Burkina Faso is not an outcast. The very head of ECOWAS had stood in Ouagadougou and refused to call the AS alliance a betrayal. Instead, he framed it as part of a broader family dynamic, one that might yet be reconciled. This was political capital that Traoré could not manufacture on his own. Within Burkina Faso's political landscape, the message strengthened the government's legitimacy. Opposition figures who accused Traoré of recklessly severing ties with ECOWAS suddenly found themselves challenged. If the chair of ECOWAS himself was willing to speak of brotherhood, then how could critics continue to argue that Traoré had led the country into irreversible isolation? The lines of political debate shifted, if only slightly, in favor of the young captain. For ECOWAS as an institution, however, the consequences were more complicated. The organization has struggled with its identity ever since the AES bloc emerged. Should it punish members who walk away, or should it adapt and seek dialogue? By visiting Ouagadougou, the Sierra Leonean leader tilted the balance toward diplomacy. His words may have soothed citizens, but they also exposed cracks within ECOWAS itself. Not all member states agreed with his tone of reconciliation, and some feared it would embolden AS leaders to maintain their distance rather than return. Civil society across the region also responded. In Burkina Faso, civic groups praised the visit as a step toward healing divisions. Youth organizations in particular saw it as validation of their demand for African-led solutions. Yet in neighboring states, activists questioned whether this show of unity would translate into real action, joint security operations, humanitarian aid, or development programs. Without tangible follow-up, they warned words might dissolve into little more than political theater. And still, the emotional resonance cannot be dismissed. Symbols shape reality. For a population weary of violence, sanctions, and political speeches from distant capitals, the simple acknowledgement of shared struggle was itself a political act. It redefined how citizens perceive their place in West Africa not as exiles, but as brothers and sisters with a voice. The civil and political consequences of this visit may not be measured in immediate policy shifts, but in the renewed confidence it gave to a people fighting for survival. For Burkina Faso, hope itself became a form of resistance, and hope, when nurtured, has the power to reshape politics. Beyond West Africa, the world paid close attention to this encounter. In Washington, analysts who had argued that Burkina Faso's exit from ECOWAS would leave the nation cornered suddenly found their assumptions shaken. The U.S. strategy toward the Sahel has long relied on regional blocs like ECOWAS to exert pressure and maintain alignment with Western security frameworks. But the image of the ECOWAS chair himself standing beside Ibrahim Traoré complicated that calculus. Was this still a fractured alliance, or was Africa quietly redrawing its own political map without asking for outside permission? For American policymakers, the implications were troubling. If Burkina Faso could leave ECOWAS, align with Mali and Niger, strengthen ties with Russia, and still receive visits of solidarity from ECOWAS leaders, then isolation was no longer a credible threat. Sanctions and diplomatic pressure, traditional tools of Western influence, began to look weaker in the face of African leaders choosing fraternity over division. Some U.S. commentators worried aloud that Washington's leverage in the Sahel was slipping through its fingers. In Europe, the reaction carried its own anxieties. France, once the uncontested power broker in the region, watched uneasily. Paris had already been forced to withdraw troops from Burkina Faso under Traoré's government, a humiliating retreat that symbolized the decline of French influence. Now, the sight of West African leaders embracing Ouagadougou undermined the narrative that Burkina Faso was a reckless outlier. Instead, it suggested that even in defiance, the Sahel nations were still part of the regional conversation, and France was increasingly excluded from it. Across Africa itself, the symbolism resonated more deeply. In Ghana, Nigeria, and Côte d'Ivoire, citizens debated the meaning of the visit. Was this a gesture of reconciliation that could lead to a new model of African unity, one not defined by colonial-era institutions? Or was it a clever maneuver to keep ACE nations from slipping too far away from ECOWAS altogether? Either way, the fact remained Africa was setting the terms of the debate, not Europe or America. Global observers outside the West also took notice. In Moscow and Beijing, the visit was interpreted as proof that African leaders were no longer willing to let outside powers dictate their relationships. Russian and Chinese media highlighted the phrase "we are one family" as evidence that Africa's sovereignty movement was gaining traction. For them, it was further confirmation that Western influence in Africa was eroding and that space was opening for alternative partnerships. At the United Nations, the event did not escape attention either. Diplomats noted the careful balance of the Sierra Leonean president's words: solidarity without explicit endorsement of AS reconciliation, without condemnation of ECOWAS. It was diplomacy in its purest form, yet its very existence challenged the assumption that regional blocs would automatically act as Western extensions. For ordinary viewers in the United States and Europe, the story raised uncomfortable questions. If Africans themselves insist they are one family despite political disputes, what right do outsiders have to insist otherwise? And if African nations are now asserting the ability to solve crises on their own terms, does that mean the era of Western dominance in African affairs is finally closing? The visit to Burkina Faso did not just signal solidarity in the Sahel, it sent a message to the world. Africa is no longer content to be managed. It is beginning to speak with its own voice, and that voice, however fragmented, is growing louder. In the end, the visit of Sierra Leone's president to Burkina Faso was more than a diplomatic courtesy. It was a reminder that Africa is still capable of writing its own script. Against the predictions of division and collapse, a different story unfolded, one of solidarity, brotherhood, and cautious hope. Yet, as powerful as the symbolism was, it came with an unspoken warning. Words alone cannot stop the gunfire in the Sahel. A speech, no matter how heartfelt, cannot rebuild villages destroyed by insurgents or bring back children lost to violence. The Burkinabé people know this reality better than anyone. They understand that solidarity must be matched with action, and that peace requires not just promises, but the hard work of security, justice, and development. If that effort fails, hope could quickly dissolve into despair, and the dream of African unity could fracture once more. But there is also opportunity. This moment shows that the wall between ECOWAS and AS is not as high as many believed. If leaders are willing to stand together in Ouagadougou, perhaps they can also sit together around a table. Perhaps what looked like the beginning of a permanent break may instead become the foundation of a stronger, more inclusive regional order, one where Africans settle their disputes as family, not as adversaries. For the United States and the wider world, this carries profound implications. The age of dictating terms to Africa is slipping away. The voices of African leaders, whether in Ouagadougou, Freetown, or Bamako, are demanding respect and recognition. Western powers may resist this shift, but ignoring it will only accelerate their loss of influence. The world must adjust to an Africa that is asserting sovereignty, not pleading for approval. And so the question lingers, not just for Africa, but for all of us: will this moment of solidarity turn into a turning point, or will it fade into the background noise of global politics? Do you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's strategies for reform and sovereignty are already bearing fruit, or is it too early to trust in his vision? Should Burkina Faso continue down this bold path, or will history demand new leadership to finish the work of peace? Your voice matters in shaping this conversation. Please share if you feel that you are among the first to recognize and support the struggle of President Ibrahim Traoré and the Burkinabé people. And subscribe if you believe that truth, dignity, and sovereignty matter more than headlines written elsewhere. Because history is being written in Burkina Faso, and the world cannot afford to look away.